Hunters, you like kabooms? That's my build pitch. The setup is just all about ignitions and making as many of them as possible. And I've got to say, using this build has been some of the most fun I've had in the game as of late, because when you see and hear this every couple button presses, whoa, that's the only type of ASMR you'll ever need in your life. Let's get into it. Here's your quick build. Winter Shroud, Stylish Executioner, Withering Blade, Grapple Grenade, Gambler's Dodge, Fragments of Faceted Resistance, Hope, Purpose, and Blessing. Here's your mod setup. Super can be any, although I typically prefer light supers to help the light Transcendence bar out. Exotic Armour is the class item with Spirit of Caliban and Spirit of the Coyote. Your exotic gun is Bastion. Armor set is flexible, but anything that gives damage resist or that can heal is my preference. I'm going to start with why this build actually works. For almost the entire time Stylish Executioner has existed in-game, the melee damage bonus and weaken you get from meleeing had only worked with unpowered melees or combination blow on Prismatic. Until Bungo snuck in this gorgeous piece of text inside their big melee tuning update. This right here is what entirely enables the build to even exist, because it puts some much needed damage back into your melee. That said, I think describing this damage buff as being tied solely to using your melee from invisibility isn't correct. It's more like using your melee from invisibility, or, whilst you are invisible, deal 300% increased melee damage, on top of the fact that melees probably don't work in the way that you'd expect them to with Stylish. First thing, range melees when used from invis don't get damage buff the entire time. It's a 300% damage buff and weaken against the first enemy it hits, and anything else the melee chains to afterwards will get hit for base damage, and that's not just with Withering Blades, that goes for Threaded Spike too. But when your melee is actively flying through the air, if you then re-enter invis, the melee kind of checks itself for whether you're invisible and will then reapply Stylish's damage bonus. Take this as an example. Your melee from invis hits for 300% increased damage, then as you're out of invis, hits the second target for base damage, then in between the melee having hit the second enemy and flying towards the third, Stylish invis re-triggers, the melee then checks whether you're invisible, then is buffed back up to full damage for the rest of the enemies it hits. Why this is something that is actually a pro in the build is that if you throw a melee, then at any point go invis whilst it is flying through the air, you then get 300% increased melee damage, so it fully removes the requirement of this having to be used from invisibility to get bonus damage. In this example, I start off fully visible, land a Withering Blade kill, which triggers Stylish invis, and for every enemy that Withering goes on to hit, 300% increased melee damage bonus. It's this damage that makes the build work, and why Stylish is such a good aspect here. Your second aspect, which pairs up just as well, is Winter Shroud, and for two main reasons. One, dodging slows enemies, slows a debuff, that's more invis means more damage buff melees. Secondly though, is that whenever you slow an enemy, you get 300% increased class ability energy for 3 seconds. Guess what we've got that slows in the build? So for using Withering Blades, you get massively sped up class regen, which then feeds back into giving you more Withering Blades through Gambler's Dodge. I'll go more in depth on stats later, but 100 melee stat is essentially mandatory here for double Withering Blades back on dodging their enemies. Plus, a nice little side bonus with the aspect, anytime you dodge with Winter Shroud, you get a 50% damage resist for 4 seconds. And rounding out the rest of your base abilities is Grapple Grenade, as it applies Unravel, which Stylish appreciates, but it also counts as a melee, so both can trigger Spirit of Caliban's ignitions, but also fully benefits from Stylish's 300% melee damage bonus. If it hasn't already been obvious from everything you've seen and heard so far, you're using the exotic class item with Spirit of Caliban, where powered melee final blows trigger ignitions, with the really nice thing about pairing this up with Withering Blades being that the perk has the most teeny tiny internal cooldown, so one melee, so long as it is landing kills, can ignite on every final blow it lands, leading to some of the coolest kill and ignition chaining I've done with a build. Your other perk is one I've tested a few variations with, but ultimately, for that second perk, I landed on Spirit of the Coyote, which just gives you an extra dodge charge. But the difference that it makes, just having that extra charge to let excess ability energy flow into, makes such a difference in smoothing out the build's gameplay loop. Because with Coyote, it never feels like you have to wait for a dodge, you've always got one in the background just building up passively. Whilst we're on exotics, let's talk about Bastion because the thing's so good for the build from the damage it gives, both in that it hits like a truck and also gives melee damage boost. If you land a full burst, 300% increased melee damage. If you land a melee, the gun gets 45% increased damage, faster reload, and charge time. I've tried using a 1-2 punch shotgun in the build, and whilst they're nice for the melee damage boost, they suck at being just actually useful guns for chunking healthy targets, which is something that this build lacks from abilities, and the niche that Bastion fills. Plus the gun's melee damage buff and Stylish work alongside each other, so at times you can have up to 600% damage boosted melees. The gun is a workhorse in the build. Since I've put it on, I can't take it off, and I would recommend the same for you too. For your fragments, this is a build that would honestly love to have so many more spots than 4. There's so many great picks that I would like to run, but ultimately I've landed on Facets of Resistance, Hope, Purpose, and Blessing. Purpose, Protection, and Blessing are nice ways to tack extra survivability into the kit, with Blessing being really good alongside Invis in that you land a melee final blow, health regen then starts to trigger, but as your Invis, enemies will stop shooting at you, so that health regen very consistently turns into a full heal. It's like having a watered down mini restoration at times, and Hope is then how you're getting class abilities back even faster, giving class regen for elemental buffs you have active. 40% bonus class regen with 1 buff, and 60% with 2, which you'll have consistently with either Invis and your Fast to the Purpose buff. Your super in the build is very flexible, but I'll touch on why you might want to pick one over the other in a little bit. Alright, that's pretty much everything that makes up the build, so let's talk gameplay and interactions. In the footage, the build might look like it's just randomly chucking stuff, but you do have to pay a surprising amount of attention to what goes on in the build, mainly around prioritizing low health targets with Withering Blades and playing around Invis and your damage buffs. The big thing is that you always want Withering Blades to be the thing that kills a target. I know that sounds simple and quite obvious, but with how chaotic this build can get at times, it's so easy to forget this. Remember that the first melee is the only one to be damage buffed, so if you don't land a kill, every enemy Withering Blade goes on to hits for base damage, making ignitions less consistent. That's not to say every melee kill has to kill a target, as Withering Blade followed up by Bastion is a great way to set up your next blade for 600% increased damage, but generally it's a good rule to follow. Typically, if I'm Invis, I use Withering Blade, and if I'm visible but an enemy is in kill range from Withering Blade, I'll melee there too. And when there's nothing you can immediately kill with a melee, Bastion should be your go-to. Anything that has a slightly large health bar, you should always be using Bastion to rip into it, followed up by a melee to get you back into Invis. Everything I've just said, once you use the build for a little bit, will become second nature. You'll get really used to when it's right to Withering Blade and when it's right to use Bastion. The only other thing to do with playing around melee damage boosts is that on entering Stylish Executioner's Invis, there is a tiny amount of time where inputting an action will not break Invis, and I'm talking maybe like half a second, but in that time, if you can, that is the perfect point at which to use Withering Blade or Grapple, because you can guarantee that they'll both be damage boosted by 300%. Like here for example, I land the Withering Blade kill, go Invis, but then I use the second one almost immediately, and it doesn't break my Invis, and the entire melee is fully damage buffed from Stylish. As for more the general gameplay of the build, it is aggressive and it likes to get up close and is able to do so from Invis. But this build doesn't have a great ability to tank lots of damage, so playing around Invis, playing around Facets of Purpose orbs will be important. I'm not trying to make it out like you're some frail little fragile thing that's going to get blown over by a champ, but you're definitely no Strongholds Titan that can stand in front of a boss and just never die. This build though is one that is just so amazingly lethal against what it fights that in a way, it being so good at killing stuff is its survivability. Dead enemies can't really shoot back and this thing can kill chains so well. And lastly, this is going to be kind of the Transcendence part of the gameplay segment, because you've got some choices to make in the build. Dark Transcendence is entirely covered. You so much as blink and your Dark Transcendence bar is full from all the Withering Blade spam. It's much more Light Transcendence that you have to be thinking about, and you're really guessing it from either supers or guns. I know people rag on the super, but Storm's Edge is just so good at filling that niche of filling up your Transcendence bar, with Tether also being decent and Goldie being not that good. But you've also got to look at these in mind that they change Facet of Purpose's effect, with Restoration being your best survivability buff, and Bolt Charge being really good at enabling Facet of Hope basically the entire time. If you were to take Goldie, I'd say it's the only time where it would be okay to change your fragment list, as Purpose and Blessing fill essentially the same role when it's Restoration, so Dawn can be switched out in this case for Blessing to buff Goldie. However, I think the super that interacts best with this build is Silk Strike. It's a great roaming super, but the really cool part is that on Silk Strike ending, you get both dodge charges back, and if at any point you dodge during your super, Gambler's Dodge works in full effect and gives both melee charges back, meaning you come out of Silk Strike being able to fully restart the build's whole combo loop. Guns can also fill Light Transcendence, but if you want to run something like a light damage Aero Denial, you need to be using Special Finisher so well. The last thing you want is Bastion to run out of ammo, but because you get faster Transcendence, you get more melees, and more melees mean more orbs from the mod setup as you're running triple heavy-handed. So you do rely more on Special Finisher, but you also have more opportunities to use it from more melees being thrown out. For any version of this build though, do run at least one light gun. It'll really help that light bar out. You can tinker and mix and match on super and guns till you find a combo that you really like and that sticks. For your stats, I think there's really only one way to run this, and it's with as high melee stats as possible and as close to 100 class. I'll put those stats on an equal tier of priority, then focus on grenade, super, then weapon stats. For your mod setup, this is designed around making as many orbs as possible to then feed back into allowing Special Finisher to steadily feed Bastion ammo, whilst giving you some really good super regen. Helmet is double hands-on with one kinetic siphon, arms is triple heavy-handed, chest is charged up, melee damage resist, kinetic ammo generation, legs is stacks on stacks, absolution, and recuperation. Class is double reaper, one special finisher. And lastly, for the seasonal artifact mods, I'm not too sure how Bungie plans on going forward with the artifact. Well, it's me from the future, and I've got an answer to that question, as Bungie put out a blog post talking about artifacts post me doing my voiceover. Turns out, you've got 7 artifacts to choose from. For the time being, I'm just going to talk about the Renegades artifact, but post June 9th, I'm going to be sure to include all artifacts when talking builds. We cool? Right, back to me from before. So if it's Renegade's artifact that is still active, you're going to want all of these. The big things at the minute is that Bastion is able to print loads of ammo for itself from kinetic synthesis, and kinetic rupture also lets it hit for more damage. What's by far the best though is the combo of Power from Pain, Singularity Blade, and Void Infestation. And that's the Boom Hunter! I hope this build is one that brings something new to the table for you hunters. It's a really powerful build once you nail the gameplay loops, and one I've been performing really well with. There's a solo GM up on the channel, although that's also being the background gameplay too, if you want to see something a bit more uncut of what the build can do. That is about it from me though. See ya!